I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This week I'm talking to journalist and author Val Bourne about her book The Living Jigsaw, The Secret Life in Your Garden. As you can imagine, I do a fair bit of reading in the course of researching future guests and topics, and I can be a fairly harsh critic. I'd estimate that for every book I read and love, maybe 4 or 5 are cast aside for one reason or another. One of my bugbears with garden books is that quite often they're a mashup of information that the author has read elsewhere, then regurgitated onto the page. And I hope that if you listen to episodes of the podcast, you'll have spotted by now that Roots and All guests are experts who do their own research and speak from their own experiences. And this was one of the reasons I loved Val's book so much. Val is a perfect example of a gardener who loves ornamental plants as well as respects the wildlife in her garden. She walks the walk, she produces writing based on her observations, and has a palpable love for all the things that share her garden. I started by asking Val about how the book came to life.
Yes. Well, it actually started when I first started writing in 1995. And I was teaching before then, and I started a writing career about plants because I've always gardened and I've always been organic. And I went on a radio program called Dig It, which was on Radio Thames Valley, which is no more. And I sat in with another chap, and the public asked us questions. And by then I was in my mid-40s, and I was absolutely shocked because every question about black spot on roses, mildew on phloxes, sulking lavenders, the answer was always go down to the garden centre and buy a chemical. And I felt completely out of kilter with the gardening world, having been organic all my life. And to cut a long story short, after about 6 weeks, the producer took me aside and said, "Val, you have a wonderful voice, but no one is interested in organic gardening. It's wacky." And I was given the push. And I decided I would write a book about my garden in Hook Norton. I had a lovely garden there. It was in the Yellow Book. And I decided I would write a book to say why it was healthy. But I had a huge problem because I didn't know why it was healthy. So I started to look at my insect life, beginning with ladybirds, and I started to look at my plants and try to assess why I didn't have all these problems, like aphids on my hellebores and all the other things that other people seem to be having problems with. And I finally sort of got a handle on it after 2 small children visited the garden, and we were watching some aphids on a white achillea, and because there were black fly on white achillea, the children noticed them, and they started asking questions. And I said, they were feeding on the plant sap, and the sap went into their body, and it would come out the other end of their bottoms, and then it would cause this black sooty mold. And I was talking about the ants going up and down, that they farm the aphids, and they spray formic acid from their knees to protect the aphids because they want to eat the honeydew. And then a little parasitic wasp came down, and I started to talk about how a parasitic wasp, which looks exactly like a black fly nearly, will lay 1 egg inside each aphid, and then the new parasitic wasp will come out of the aphid's stomach. And I found some mummified aphids with holes in, and they were all very fascinated. And then we sat down, and some blue tips were busy. And I said, that they had to collect 10,000 wriggly things in order to feed their chicks. And these children were only 6 or 7, but they were really fascinated. And because they were children, I said to them, it's just like a living jigsaw. So the idea of writing the title came then. Well, I did produce a book about the Hook Norton garden, which is called The Natural Gardener. It came out in 2004, 2005, and won the Practical Book of the Year. But the title stayed with me. And in actual fact, I'd wanted to call that book Gardening with the Planet. But the publisher, Francis Lincoln, said it was too pretentious. So I got stuck with A Natural Gardener. Well, when I moved to Cold Aston 14 or 15 years ago, to a completely derelict house and garden, the shed was full of every chemical known to man, including DDT. I had to go right back down the ladder, not having a beautiful garden and no wildlife at all. And then I had to think about how to structure this new garden to attract wildlife. And The Living Jigsaw is the book about the new garden and how I made the garden so that it would be as attractive to wildlife as possible.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to say that Dig It is still broadcasting on my local radio in Sussex, and unfortunately, that was part of the reason I started the podcast, because the advice is pretty much the same now, to spray everything.
When I first started to talk about organic gardening, I had no money when I started writing. I was living on my own. I would go out and do talks about organic gardening just to earn a bit of extra dosh, and also to get out and see people. And I was met with huge resentment, because what was this organic gardening? It was newfangled. Bob Flowerdew was not long ago had been on the telly growing things in old tyres, and they didn't really understand the nitty-gritty of organic gardening. It's nothing to do with old tyres or compost heaps or comfrey tea. It's about having an ecosystem in your garden, those interactions, those tiny interactions. And I sat at meetings with the National Trust head gardeners, and they would say, we can't garden without chemicals. Well, that has all changed. Mm-hmm. And my column that I write in Amateur Gardening, which I won Columnist of the Year for a couple of years ago, it gets a terrific response. People are terrifically interested in wildlife, and they're really trying their best. But it's very difficult for them to know how to do it because the advice is so poor. There are still a lot of dinosaurs out there. And the sad thing about a lot of garden writers, I'm afraid, is that they're not really keen gardeners. Whereas I live and breathe my garden. I'm out there every day, champing at the bit to do something.
Yeah, I mean, that you are right, completely right. Obviously people are much more interested. There are still pockets of resistance or ignorance. But, one of the things that I find working with clients in gardens is that they do still object to the fact that there are pests. And obviously slugs and snails are a particular concern for people. And you do talk about that in the book. So I wondered if you could kind of tell me how bad slug pellets are.
I have never used slug pellets. I do not have a garden that's overrun with slugs. But the trouble is with every toxin that you put on the garden is that it cannot discriminate. It kills across the board. So when you put an insecticide on your aphids, you're killing all your ladybirds as well. Everything goes. And it's the same with slugs. You put some slug pellets down. They've got this bran content which attracts the slugs. The blue ones are particularly lethal. But it kills all the big slugs, the little slugs. Probably got about 8 species of slugs in your garden, and probably 3 or 4 of them are really damaging to crops. The keeled slug, the grey-field slug. But a lot of the other slugs, the big slugs, eat detritus. So they clean up your garden, and they make it much harder for the other slugs to get a handle in your garden because there's nowhere for them to hide. You'll see them eating tulip petals, the big slugs. You'll see them eating faded foliage. And the reason they do it is because foliage that's decomposed contains protein, much more protein. So they're detritus eaters. And it's the same with snails. Garden snails are damaging. And but the little white-lipped and brown-lipped snails, they're detritus eaters. So I think people have got to be much more clever about how they deal with them. Because, for instance, if you want a thrush, you've got to have garden snails. If you want a hedgehog, you've got to have slugs about in September. But the thing to do, and I do this, is I go out on a summer evening after rain when they are a nuisance, and I pick off all the little slugs that I can see on my plants. Like I might be having runner beans coming up in May, and I'll go out about 9:30 with some gloves on, and I'll actually collect those, and I will kill them. And the other thing is I do in the winter, I always go around looking for clusters of garden snails that are hibernating. I found a cluster of 70 in one plant pot once.
Wow.
All sort of round. It was a plant pot with a rim, and they were all round the edge. And I just, got rid of them. So it's not a mamby-pamby thing. And I'm very glad I don't use the blue slug pellets, because the metaldehyde, there is no way of taking that chemical out of the water source. People sometimes say to me, I live miles from a river, but it's very motile. So it leaves the slug pellet after rain really quickly, travels into the watercourse, and then that toxin is there in the watercourse. And in the wet summer of 2012 in Essex, the levels were way, way higher. I think it was 100 times higher than they should have been, and the residents were having to drink this because they couldn't take it out of the water. And there was a ban, but I think it's been lifted. And we've got to educate people about how to manage their gardens. Because I think there's still a feeling that you can't have a lovely garden unless you spray, and that, you must always, when you see early aphids, put some chemical on them, because otherwise they will turn into a plague of locusts. It's rubbish. It all stems back to Gardener's World with Percy Thrower and Arthur, making gardeners feel they had to do these things, and when they were really being almost certainly paid by ICI.
How about the kind of wildlife-friendly slug pellets that you see on the market now?
Well, they still kill all the. They still get rid of your good slugs.
Mm.
We've been looking at a report by a guy called Barnes, who was an air raid warden in the Second World War, and he was a Rothamsted scientist, and he had to go out at night, and he recorded lots and lots of slugs, and he records certain slugs that predated other slugs, and he's making really detailed records about which gardens they were in. Now, it's as thorough as that. He had 5-6 years to do it. So he's got maps with which slugs he found in which gardens. The really useful slugs that predated other slugs, we've got far fewer numbers of them. And this is probably because the food chain, they're at the top of the food chain, and they were accumulating metaldehyde because it was already, being used in some places in agriculture. So it's very difficult for the gardening public because, of course, they do want to be organic. And when I'm doing my talks, a lot of people rush up to me and they say, I'm organic. I only use garlic spray. I only use soft soap. And you have to explain to them that actually soft soap and garlic spray, although they might be organic materials, they're actually doing the same sort of ecological damage because they're wiping out all the small insects that are around. And there's lots of examples of chemicals causing more problems than they solve. There was a mite called the fruit tree mite that used to be a slight problem in orchards. And then orchard owners were encouraged to use tar washes made in Holland during the 1930s and 40s. And suddenly this fruit tree mite, red spider mite, became a real problem in orchards. So after the war, one of the research stations, I think it was Long Ashton, but I'd have to look up my notes, decided they would do an experiment and look at mites in orchards that had been sprayed and count them, and they'd look at mites in organic orchards that hadn't been tar washed. And they found that there were far more mites were in the orchards where the tar wash was applied, because in the organic orchard, that red fruit tree mite had 40-something natural predators, and it was being kept under control by these natural predators. And the research station presented this information to the fruit trade, and they ignored it. And these tar washes kept being applied until they were banned because they were affecting people's lungs. So it's a very difficult message to get across that, things with organic on them, aren't always what they seem. And that because you're at the end of the food chain, and humans are, these toxins are really damaging, and we're going to have a bit of a whirlwind around glyphosate in the near future, and I think that probably will be banned. That's Roundup, because it's been implicated with cancer.
I think one of the keys to your garden, and obviously you said people sometimes expect that organic gardens can't look beautiful and well kept, and your book completely blows up that theory, because your garden is absolutely beautiful. And sometimes I think that we choose plants maybe that are more susceptible to pests and diseases, and that might need a bit more artificial.
No, that's absolutely not true. I grow lots of plants that are difficult to grow, like trilliums, for instance. I grow lots of things that are really tricky because I'm a keen gardener and I love a challenge. The key to it is actually choosing good plants. I try plants for the RHS and we give AGMs to the best plants. So always look for the AGM logo. And the other thing is I put my plants in the right place so that they're happy. When I did that radio program, I looked back at the questions because I wrote them down. And people on the Chilterns, which is a very dry area with thin chalk, were phoning up because they had mildew on their phloxes. And I said, well, why are you growing phloxes? They're plants, North American plants of damp meadows. Grow other things that would do much better for you, like hardy geraniums, pinks. So a lot of it is putting plants in the right place. So I have 3 main areas in my garden. I have a spring border, a summer border along the front of the cottage, because I have a south-facing garden. And then I have an autumn border on the southwestern edge to catch the fading sun. And I garden those areas really seriously, and they're packed with lots and lots of plants. But I don't grow things I know won't do well for me. I can't grow zinnias. I'm too cold. I live in a village called Cold Aston on top of the Cotswolds. There are certain things I can't grow. But because I'm cold, I grow a lot of roses in my summer border, a lot of peonies. I live at Spring Cottage, so the soil stays quite damp, and I grow lots of phloxes. I'm selecting things I know will do well here, but I'm also growing really challenging things.
So talking about the roses, are they all suitable to be grown in an organic garden, or have you found that some are better than
they're
others?
not. Actually, my downfall on the radio program when I got the push was that this woman phoned up about Zephyrin Druin, the climbing rose, and she said it had black spot, it wouldn't grow. And I said, well, it's a miserable rose. Why are you growing it? Dig it up. And that was, sacrilege. And that was, there's a lot of roses, very highly bred roses from a certain era that are very disease prone. But there's been a huge sea change in growing roses. And there was a German rose firm called Cordes, and they're based near Hamburg. And German gardeners are much more eco-friendly than we are. They got to it a lot earlier than we did. And they wouldn't buy roses because they were diseased, and they wouldn't use the sulfur-based sprays and fungicides and things like that. So this rose firm, Cordes, had all these roses and nobody was buying them, and the company was going to go down the tubes. So a new generation took over, and they just left all the rose fields unsprayed, and they left them for about 3 or 4 years, and they selected out of thousands of seedlings about 6 roses that were completely bomb-proof, and they started a new breeding program. So the rose I started to grow here was the Rose of the Year in 2006, and it was called Champagne Moment. And I love roses. I always talk in the rose tent at Hampton Court and promote them. And I planted this rose, and it's a floribunda, and I wasn't really that keen on floribundas, so I thought, they're a bit old-fashioned. This rose was tremendous. I still got these roses. It's a champagne-coloured buff white rose, which looks lovely in summer sun. And I'm growing David Austin's Wild Eve with it. There's lots of roses out there now that are healthy. Harkness roses breed a lot of roses. They don't spray their fields. I'm growing Mary Berry, Chandos Beauty from them. Modern rose breeding. Look for healthy roses. David Austin released the first from a new breeding program about 4 years ago called Olivia Rose Austin. That's completely healthy. I give my roses 2 years. I grew one called Boscobel, which looked lovely, and it was too diseased and weak, and I just dug it up. But there are so many healthy roses out there, and I try to list them in the book. Roses do well here because we're open and airy and cold, which is what roses like. And I do look after them. I prune them properly. I feed them. But I don't worry if they get a bit of aphid. I just rub them off with my fingers if they bother me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's brilliant advice, really, because as you say, I've got a tendency to go through the catalogues and spot these unusual looking roses from yesteryear, and they tend to, sometimes they keel over. So
the advice is if you've got a rose like that and it's really not doing well, dig it up. Put a perennial in the hole where you took the rose out. Hardy geraniums are good. And then plant your new rose about 2 feet away. Okay. This business of putting roses in cardboard boxes and sinking them in the ground is rubbish. They just need to be in a new bit of ground. There is a thing called rose sickness, but we don't grow our roses like we used to in dedicated rose beds anymore. My roses have got all sorts of insect-friendly plants with them. Astrantias, scabious, campanulas, sedums, umbellifers of different sorts, because I want to pull in the hoverflies, all these little wasp-like creatures you see. They don't sting, they are flies, and they lay one egg near colonies of aphids, and then their maggot-like larvae eat the aphids. So I'm deliberately interplanting all my roses with lots of annuals and perennials that I know will pull in insect life.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. So as I say, your garden is stunning. It's a real gardener's garden and it's beautiful. How much of that garden do you let run wild, and is it important to leave areas kind of undisturbed?
I think undisturbed areas are terrifically important. And when I came here, there was an area on the south wall, which is actually on the front of the book, where I planted honeysuckle and some roses, including the Queen of Denmark, which is the old name. It's got a German name, which I can't pronounce. But the Queen of Denmark will get you there. It's a very good rose. I planted that area up with honeysuckle and various roses all along the south wall. I've got things like the Generous Gardener, Buff Beauty, Cecilia, Felicia. So I've got a lot of roses there. And there's one particular area, it's a semicircle, that I don't go into at all. I just leave it. And that's the area where the hedgehog goes to build his day roost. Now, this year, I don't know whether I've got a hibernating hedgehog. I haven't found one or seen any evidence. But we've always had a hedgehog or two in the garden here. And I always leave moss and leaves because they build these day roosts very quickly using moss and leaves. So when I'm collecting my leaves up for my leaf litter, which I make to put on my trilliums, I always leave all the wilder edges and plant quite simple plants along there that I know are insect-friendly with the roses. I've got often used pulmonarias. So I'm leaving certain areas. I think one of the most interesting areas, though, is the mini meadow, which is in the middle of the garden. Mm-hmm. because I interviewed a man called Matthew Oates, who was the butterfly man of the National Trust, probably about 15 years ago, and the National Trust stopped mowing their grass because they couldn't afford to do it anymore. It was too costly on labour and fossil fuel. So they decided they would just cut a path through these bits of long and leave the grass either side. Public loved it, but also wildflowers came back in the gardens, and the numbers of certain butterflies, brown butterflies, gatekeepers, ringlets, it just soared. So I thought, well, I'm going to do that here. I'm going to build in an area of long grass, and I'm going to introduce things like yellow rattle, and things came back. And that's one of the best areas in the garden. People are drawn to it like a magnet when they come here in summer and they see the yellow rattle and the wildflowers. The yellow rattle attracts one bee that doesn't go on anything else. It provides terrific shelter for ground beetles and small mammals and things like that. We always find vole runs in the garden when we cut it. It's cut once a year at the end of September, sometimes by hand, sometimes, if we're very busy, a high cut. We prefer to cut it by hand because we often find amphibians in it. So, it's not a huge area for us. We just sort of get down and do a bit every day. But it's such an interesting area, and our ringlet numbers went up. All sorts of things happen in that area. And I'm very, very keen on people leaving their verges to grow and planting things like cowslips and blue geraniums, and we've got wild daffodils on our verge. Everybody has got a verge, and for some reason they still think they should mow it within an inch of its life. Well, I suppose we've got more unmown grass here than we have mown grass, but the bits that we do mow are kept meticulously neat, so they sort of set off the wilder bits, and we have a system of breaking sticks and putting them in the ground so they look a bit like antlers, and then mowing up to them. That's historically because we've got 4 grandchildren, and we wanted to say to them, don't go over the sticks, because that's where all the daffodil bulbs are, and all the things like the fritillarias that are self-feeding, and all the things that happen in that area. It goes right through from now, where I'm looking at wild daffodils, right through to the end of the season. There are things in there that flower. So we just make these sticks, and it's become part of the garden. Mm. We use our old pea sticks, actually.
That's a brilliant
Except
idea.
we haven't been able to get any pea sticks this year because we're trapped indoors.
No, it's not ideal, is it?
No.
I was going to say, just to finish, perhaps if you don't mind, could you maybe share one of your best tips for having a wildlife garden, and also perhaps one of the things that people should really avoid if they do want to have a wildlife garden?
Well, I think definitely don't mow all your lawn. There's a lot on plant life. There's a good verge guide, so don't mow your verges, because a lot of Britain's wildflowers no longer exist on farms. They're clinging to road verges. And wildflowers are natives, and they have a particular association with British insects. So I think that's really important. Have some areas of long grass. Have early flowers that are around in February, March time. I have hellebores here. I have crocuses. I have loads of snowdrops. And then we're not so good attracting early bees here. Because we're cold. Have a whole range of flowers that go right through. Have lots of single flowers. If you're going to grow roses, I've got a big collection of double peonies, but I have a lot of single flowers that go with them because doubles are no good for insects. So keep the nectar supply going right through the year. So you've also got late flowers. And there's one flower I think is an amazing wildlife plant, and that's valerian. Centranthus ruber, because it has these flowers with very long tubes, and you can keep deadheading it and it will keep flowering. It will begin in about April, May. It's a terrifically good moth plant, and it's the one plant that the hummingbird hawk moth really loves in our garden. So I think, have some wilder areas, don't mow all your grass, and get that succession of flowers right the way through. and do it by putting plants in the right place. So you have a spring border, a summer border, and an autumn border. Don't have a border that you're planning to do for 12 months, because a lot of gardeners make that mistake. It looks awful because you get a fading peony next to an aster. You know, plants have a peak in their life, just like we do, and then they begin to fade and look a bit tatty. So, you know, that's another very, very good tip. And I think get out there and look at what's happening. If you get a problem in your garden and you really start to fret, you know, that, oh gosh, you know, my runner beans have been nipped out by slugs or something, you know, you've got to remember that wildlife is terrifically dynamic. So you'll get a year when slugs are a problem, more of a problem than another year. You'll get a vole year when they dig up all your peas. You know, be tolerant, realize that it's dynamic, and learn to sit on the fence and let nature sort it out. I would never, hardly ever touch an aphid. When I see an aphid colony, I don't reach for the sprayer, I reach for the camera and I record what's happening, and they just clean it up for me. And being an organic gardener, I think, is a wonderful thing. You know, somebody who doesn't use anything in their gardens, because you've got this tapestry of life all around you. And we get terrific bird life here now. We never got any birds when we moved here because there was nothing in the garden at all, apart from one white beam in the corner. So I've planted everything in my garden myself, apart from the apricot, which the Best Beloved did. And when we did the book, the Best Beloved was instrumental. I went out on top of gardening, because I do all my own gardening, so that Marianne Majoris could come and do the photos of the garden. I was gardening in the evenings. I was writing in the day, writing at the weekends, because I had all my journalistic load and the book. And then about when the light was soft enough, I would go out with my camera and try to catch insects. And my favourite picture in the book is the lacewing eggs hanging off the scabious. There's a picture of an ordinary scabious with lacewing eggs. And I said to the Best Beloved, I've got a picture missing and I cannot find it. I'm looking for lacewing eggs. I know they must be out there because we've got lacewings up in the trees. I've seen the odd lacewing larva, but I can't find the eggs. And the Best Beloved is short-sighted. So he took his glasses off and he went round the garden on his hands and knees and finally found some and photographed them for me. Greater love has no man.
He's brilliant. We all need one.
Yes, we do.
I love that story. I think that's fantastic. Well, I think that's a really nice thing to finish on. Are you happy that we've kind of covered everything?
Yeah, I just want to mention two plants very quickly. Yep. You talked about something that was good for birds in autumn. Rosa glauca. Lots of birds don't touch the rose hips on my roses. But Rosa glauca, which is the grey-leafed rose with the small pink flowers, if you've got room for that in a wilder place, the birds love the seeds in the hips. And the other one is ivy. Arborescent ivy, when it gets into that woody stage and it starts to flower. It flowers in November, October time, so it's a very good nectar source for late-flying honeybees and flies and wasps. I'm a great supporter of the wasp. And then you get the berries coming quite late in the year for thrushes and blackbirds. So if you've got a bit of ivy that you could leave to go arborescent, which is the woody growth, the second stage of growth, that's a terrific wildlife plant. We've got a couple of areas here where we just leave it to ramble over the wall. Just nothing special, just ordinary heterohelix English ivy. You know, it was seeded probably by the birds years ago because it's a very old garden. The cottage dates from 1720, and the name on the enclosure map was the Hovel in the Waste.
It's a brave gardener indeed that could attempt to build their Eden in cold Aston at the Hovel in the Waste, and yet Val's managed it. A huge thank you to her for taking the time to chat to me and share her knowledge with all of us. If you hear any odd noises in the background, my dog was snoring ridiculously loudly under my desk, so I apologise on her behalf, but she's getting on a bit. She's a bit thick round the middle and sleeping heavily is her favourite pastime. Thank you to you for listening. Have a good week and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk. where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.